Before I introduce our instructor, Dr. Paul Schutz, I'd like to welcome all of you that I can see on the screen that I've had a conversation with, and all of you that I can't see who have registered and are going to be here for this series on Laudato Si, which is sponsored by Spirit Alive. For those of you who are with us for the first time, and I think many people are with us for the first time, my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, which is a new educational initiative sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph, which provides programming on matters related to faith and theology. So most of our life has been spent in high school education, and now this is something that we feel some exigency about, as more and more people are looking for places where they can go for intelligent conversation. So I understand, as I just said, that there are about 191 registrants. I think that there are people from 17 states in the United States, someone from Australia, and also someone from El Salvador. So we love having all of you, and on behalf of all Sisters of St. Joseph, I welcome you to this program. A last thing, because there are 191 people signed up, we can't put everybody on the screen. So all of you that we can't see or invisible, we want you to know that you're very welcome. But Paul asked if there could be some people on the screen so he's not talking into a void, and I understand that. So I took the liberty of contacting 14 or 15 people. 2 aren't able to be here tonight because of emergencies, but I took, how are you, Maria? Nice to see you. But I took the liberty of inviting all of these people here who are interested in Laudato Si and certainly in the environment. So with that said, let me formally introduce, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Schutz, who's joining us from, don't be jealous, from Hawaii. And the reason he's in Hawaii is that he's on a well-deserved vacation after having successfully fulfilled all the requirements for tenure and promotion at Santa Clara University. So if he's sipping daiquiris or Mai Tais during the presentation tonight, don't be surprised. But congratulations, Paul. Dr. Schutz majored in English, music, and film studies as an undergrad, and he eventually made his way to Fordham University, where he completed his doctorate in systematic theology and wrote his dissertation under our own Sister Elizabeth Johnson. His research focuses on how scientific knowledge grounds and informs our relationship with the natural world and other than human creatures. He's authored numerous publications in scholarly journals. He is the recipient of many awards for teaching and scholarship. He is nervous, but looking forward to bringing us into a more profound engagement with the vision of Laudato Si. So thank you, Paul. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks in a special way to the folks who are part of our seminar within a webinar here on the screen, trying to foster, as Maria said, a little bit more dynamic engagement, some conversation live. In addition to that, for folks who are out in webinar land, you'll see that you have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to use that at any time throughout the presentation today to submit questions to me or to the group. And at the end of every session, we'll dedicate a significant portion of the time to taking up some of those questions and being able to discuss what's on the minds of our participants even more fully. So I'm delighted to be here with you all and to get started today with the 7-week series on Laudato Si. In a minute, I'll say a little bit about kind of the structure of our meetings and what our goals are and that kind of stuff. But before that, I thought it would be good for all of us who are here on the screen together just to do a quick round of what I call lightning round introductions, asking you all to share your name, your location, your job or your work, whatever it might be, and what brings you to the course in, let's say, 20 seconds or less. So a real quick round of introductions, and I'll just call on folks to be able to do that. So I'll model it first. So my name is Paul Schutz. I am currently in Hawaii, but typically in Santa Clara, California. I'm an associate professor almost in the religious studies department here at Santa Clara University, and I am here as the instructor for this course, and I'm really looking forward to it. So Virginia, could you tell us about yourself?
Virginia Navarro. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I work as the assistant to the publisher of Harper's Magazine, and I was drawn to the course by the title of, from vision to practice, because it's always the thing is like, well, how do I do something practical? Excellent.
Yeah. Tom?
My name is Deacon Tom Cervone, and I'm from Evansville, Indiana. And I have a doctorate and postdoctorate in ecology. And I've been writing articles for The Message, which is the Catholic newspaper here in our diocese in Evansville, for Bishop Joseph Siegel. And I'm very interested, and these articles complement Laudato Si. And there's been 18 of them now that we've written.
Great. Thank you. And just a side note, I've known Tom since I was a child and was the director of worship at his parish. We are from the same place. I'm from Evansville, Indiana as well. So we'll go to Colleen next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Colleen Graney. I'm from Staten Island, New York. I work at St. John's University in Queens, New York. And what drew me to this course, I also teach. I work full-time as an administrator, but I teach in our environmental sustainability program as an adjunct professor, and I'd like to incorporate Laudato Si into my classes a bit more.
Excellent. Yeah. Karen?
Hi, I'm Sister Karen Burke. I'm a sister of St. Joseph from Brentwood, Long Island. About 6 years ago, I took a leap of faith and actually left higher education to coordinate the land initiatives for the Sisters of St. Joseph on our Brentwood campus. So I coordinate our sustainability department and coordinate all of the land projects that we're currently doing in Brentwood. Great to be here.
Good to have you. And Judy?
Hi, Judy Mannix. I'm here in El Salvador, and I'm a sister of the Good Shepherd in the process of relocating back to the New York province in a few months. And let's see, I've been here 7.5 years, so it's a little difficult to leave. But we certainly see the effects of the destruction of our planet around here a lot. And our congregation recently signed on to the action plan for Laudato Si. And when I saw this offer for this course, I just felt like it was an opportunity for me to become more immersed in the encyclical and just orient myself more and see more what I can do in terms of the practice.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, to Bonnie.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Duval. I live in Richmond, Virginia. I work in healthcare IT with the electronic medical records. What brought me to the course is I am involved with the Sisters of Bon Secours, Justice, Peace, and Integrity. And I challenged everybody else to take this course, so I kind of had to do it myself.
Well, thank you. Good marketing for us all. St. Joseph in particular. Let's go to Sister Carrie.
Hi, how are you? My name's Carrie Handel. I'm a sister of St. Joseph from Brentwood. I'm one of the coordinators of our vacation and retreat house on the beautiful Shinnecock Bay, where we also have some environmental issues, where we have some projects going on there, and I'm very much interested in this topic.
Excellent. Thank you. To Diane.
Hi, I'm a Dominican sister from Amityville, New York. I currently serve on our leadership team, and I've been involved before this present position when I served in a parish and Laudato Si was first published. We had various parishioners engaged in study around that and in different aspects, committees in our congregation and with the Josephites as well. I'm just happy to learn about it. We also have Homecoming Farm on our property, which we hope is a living example of what Pope Francis writes about.
Excellent. Thank you. Maurice?
My name is Maurice Lang. My wife and I just relocated to Castroville, Texas, which is near San Antonio. I serve as Director of Justice and Peace for the Presentation Sisters, U.S. unit, and at least a couple of those, Sister Vera and Sister Antonio, are part of the course tonight. My job is to educate and animate them in matters of justice and peace and care of the earth. I have a distinct passion for earth myself, so I'd like to dive in even deeper into Laudato Si with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And Frank?
Hi, my name is Frank McCann. I'm the Peace Through Justice Facilitator for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. We operate in the UK, East Coast and West Coast of the US. I'm also the UN representative, and I'm coming to you from our Peace House of Hospitality for Asylum Seekers here in Jersey City, New Jersey, and just came off our chapter closing weekend, where I did introduce the Laudato Si Action platform progress that we've been making to the rest of the congregation. They were very excited about what's going on.
Great. Thank you. And Maria Iannucci last.
It's me. Marie, go ahead.
Yeah.
My name is Maria Iannucci. I recently moved to Brooklyn, New York, and I work at Fontbonne Hall Academy. I'm a science teacher. I was very involved with the Science and Religion seminar at the University of Notre Dame. I have a real passion for the environment and for connecting young people to nature. So I'm here to hear Laudato Si one more time and to be re-inspired.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you, as well as everybody who's out there, as I like to call it, in webinar land, for being with us today. I thought I would start just really quickly, just to give you a couple more autobiographical details about myself and how I came to this work, because it's really it's a lifelong love of creation and a lifelong love of what I would call flourishing, of seeing life kind of flourish and emerge and you know, in relationship. That has been a big part of kind of who I am and what I've always kind of tried to be about. As Sister Maria mentioned, you know, I studied English at BC, as well as music and film. But before that, I wanted to double major in physics and English, which you can probably already imagine is a terrible idea. And it was, because eventually calculus got the better of me. And I told my mentor in the physics department at Boston College, you know, I think I have a romantic relationship with this discipline. I really love spending time with it, but I just don't see the long-term potential. You know, that's kind of how I characterize that. But I've always been fascinated by science. I've been fascinated by how things work, the way that the world works. And I've also always been deeply committed to the work of justice. After my undergraduate years, I spent 2 years teaching on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota with Teach for America. And I saw kind of, as we were just hearing from Judy about the situation in, you know, El Salvador, social and ecological injustice really meeting in a radical way in the lives of those people that I served. And that has stayed with me and been a motivator for me as I spent some time working professionally in ministry, and then for 7 years was at Fordham University doing my master's and my PhD. And so nowadays I teach and I do research on the intersection of Christian theology in particular and ecology. And I'm sort of convicted and informed by that text, John 10:10, right? I've come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. That for me is so often the bedrock and the foundation of everything that I do. And I really do believe, and I want to name this commitment as we go into this course, that the whole of Christianity, the whole of what we believe as Christians and as Catholics is really about the flourishing of life amid the death and the struggle of existence, the suffering that we all experience, recognizing that too in the life of Jesus, you know, the Word made flesh, humanity, you know, there. And also that we as Christians, by virtue of that fundamental commitment, are called to participate in what I call the work of life, struggling against injustice for the liberation and flourishing of everything that exists, because we know that we believe in a creator God who loves and cherishes all things that God made. That's what the end of the first creation story in the book of Genesis said. God looked at everything that God had made together and didn't just see that it was good, saw that it was very good, when you see it as a whole. And I think that that is so important, to emphasize that holistic kind of goodness elevates the level of goodness from just being good to being wonderful. Very good. The word in the Hebrew has this really, positive overtone. And so I believe that Christianity, is a commitment to a God who sets us free and sets creation free so that all things may be fully who or what they are in the fullness of what God made them to be. And we then are called to participate in the work of cultivating that flourishing in harmony with our God. And I think that really that's what Laudato Si is all about, is about promoting that kind of perspective, this perspective that sees the world as beloved of God and calls all of us, all people of goodwill, as the quote that Francis uses, the wording he uses in that introduction, to that kind of action, to that kind of commitment. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from as we begin this course as well. And I hope that that can kind of, spill over into our conversations as we talk about Laudato Si and its practical consequences and implications. So to get us started with this first session, I just want to say very briefly kind of what the structure of our talks are going to be, what the structure of our conversations are going to be. At the beginning of every session, I'm going to ask for three or four folks, that's a little tongue twister there, who are on the screen in our seminar group to very briefly just sort of comment on something that struck them or stood out to them, something they came away with from the topic of discussion. And we're going to be reading chapter by chapter, beginning, with the introduction in chapter 1 today, chapter 2 next week, and so on up to the end. Then after that, I'll give a brief talk on the chapter, which will involve a little bit of conversation, and it'll parallel the structure of the chapter, but I'm not just going to kind of walk through us. I want to really offer an in-depth commentary, a little bit of critique from time to time, raise a few questions for us. And the aim here is not just to understand what Laudato Si is saying. We do want to do that, but we also want to be able to go deeper, to deepen our discussion and to sort of enrich it and get beyond the text in some ways, to ask, what is this really saying? What is it really about for us? Following that, I'll take questions from the group as well as questions from folks out in webinar territory. And again, you're welcome at any time to send something along using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we will do our best to be able to address all of those questions as we go forward from this. And in every session, one thing that I'll focus on is the practical applications as well. You'll hear little things here and there where either I'll rant about something like bottled water, which I'm going to do today, or, we'll do a little bit of a more structured engagement to talk about, how can we think about how to apply this in our homes and in our families and in our communities and our parishes and schools, whatever it is, so that this isn't just deep intellectual engagement, which I hope we will be able to achieve, but that it also, in addition to that, leads to a certain way of practice and living this out. So that's the kind of structure for today. Now today we've been a little heavy on introduction, so we recognize that from the outset. We're going to try to just keep pace and move through, and then going forward, we'll start right in with the questions from the room as we begin. So hopefully that sounds good. Webinar, seminar people, thumbs up. People up, webinar land, thumbs up. That's the plan. All right. So I want to just start us off. Maybe we can hear from 3 people today. Just briefly, thinking about just the introduction in chapter 1 to Laudato Si, what strikes you or stands out to you as you think about what Francis says in those first couple of portions? What's on your mind after you read the sort of introduction to Laudato Si, or that first chapter, what is happening to our common home? We hear from 2 or 3 people on that. Yeah, Diane, please.
I think what struck me is the fact that this was, his letter basically is written to everyone, regardless of religious tradition. And so to me, that really was an invitation. And even just his own language, that it's our common home. Mm-hmm. I don't think, even in light of what's happening these days in Ukraine, is just even more blatant of that. But I remember when I first read it a couple of years ago, just that fact that he was writing to every single person about the human and the non-human, and what a real invitation and a challenge that is.
That's excellent. And, you think about that, he will say when we talk about chapter 2 next week, right, that here's the part that's really for Christians. Here's the part that's really about what our Christian faith contributes. And yet this is a global crisis that has global ramifications, right? It touches on everything, as we're seeing, with the situation in Ukraine as well. As you said, this is all interconnected. And that theme of relationship and interconnectedness is going to be, kind of the golden thread that weaves, all of Laudato Si together. And so we're going to spend lots of time talking about that, and also emphasizing how that can influence and shape the way that we think about the world that we live in and the choices that we make when we frame everything in terms of this both social and ecological interdependence and interconnectedness.
I thought in chapter 1 that Pope Francis offered to us issues that we need to address. And I think one of the ways, at least I look at it, because I'm formerly a professor and an educator, that we need to educate people about those issues. And from those issues, how can we resolve them? Working together as a group. And with my ecology background and writing articles, I educate and try to encourage what can they do type of things to improve the environment and to address the things that Pope Francis has said. And of course, everything given to us has been a gift from God, and we are stewards. And it's our responsibility, more a duty of ours, to take care of what our Lord has given us. And in a nice way, I think we as educators need to help the people to know what are the things and how can we work together to make those things better for especially the water, the land, and the air. I just have a strong feeling that we are all helpers of Pope Francis in getting this done. And in May, it will be 7 years since Laudato Si has been published.
That's right.
And good things are happening, and we just need to have more of them.
Yeah, more of that practical sort of, generative action. That's right. And I love that you framed, Tom, those things in terms of, what theologians often call co-creation or co-participation with God in the work of creation, that is a deep set part of what it means to be human. Now, that hasn't been without its issues, that hasn't been without its problems, because interpreted in the wrong way, that can take us way off the rails into this paradigm of exploitation and destruction that Pope Francis is rightfully concerned about. So we'll be delving into all of that. That's excellent. Both in chapter 1, where, my students are always amazed, kind of to your point, Tom, with the background in ecology, they're like, wow, there's a lot of science in here, and they're always really taken with that, not knowing that, if folks don't know this, Pope Francis has, a degree in chemistry back in his world. So, he's dwelled in scientific, kind of thinking over the years as well. So I know, Colleen, you were going to jump in, so we'll hear from Colleen and then I'll move us ahead. Go ahead, Colleen. Oh, you're muted though.
Sorry about that. That's the comment I was going to make. I very much like that Pope Francis addresses the encyclical to all people across the globe, but he starts out with the science, and he's very much in agreement with the leading scientists of the world. So he talks about, the loss of biodiversity. He talks about the precious resource of water. He talks about waste generation. And I think one of the most piercing statements in chapter 1 is he says that our earth is beginning to look like a huge pile of filth. And that just, hits to the bone of how piercing and targeted his statements are.
Yeah, that's excellent, and really drives home kind of the purpose of this first, the first chapter, which is to open our eyes to all of the realities that constitute this thing that we often call the ecological crisis or climate change, using one of those umbrella terms, but knowing that this is deeply, deeply interconnected with other social realities and things like that. And that's a lot of what we're going to be delving into as we go forward today. All right. So I am going to, there will be some questions and dialogue built into this, but I'm going to do my little presentation next and try to kind of walk us through this introduction and first chapter, offering a little bit of commentary, raising some questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion on the other end of this process as we go through. So the first thing that I would say when we look at the introduction to Laudato Si is that those opening words are so important, right? Laudato Si, mi Signore, praise be to you, my Lord. This is the opening line of St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures, which he's going to quote in full in chapter 2. And I think what's so important about Francis of Assisi's Canticle is that it imagines not just humans, but all of creation as engaged in an act, a collective act of praising God. So it's not just each creature in isolation, but it's the whole of creation together, as we might say, a cosmic choir, praising God together, praising God together. And that framing in terms of praise is important because it leads us to see that the whole argument of Laudato Si is oriented around this theme of praise, this theme of all of creation, a cosmic liturgy, you could say, where everything has a voice and everything is participating fully, consciously, and actively in what it means to be creation. And so this is, according to Francis, what creation is for. So when we talk about the ecological crisis, it's not just something that's bad because it's an offense against God or an offense against the world. Theologically speaking, it's an offense because it disrupts the fundamental nature of nature. We could say what nature is disrupted by this crisis, because nature's fundamental purpose is to praise God. And so the ecological crisis, phenomena like extinction, silence voices, right? My mentor, Elizabeth Johnson, in her book, Ask the Beast, says never again. Extinction is never again. Never again will these creatures praise God. And Francis says something similar, which we'll talk about later on. Deforestation, falling trees sound, sour notes in this cosmic choir. They interrupt creatures' ability to be who they are and to love God, which is what they're called to do, to give praise to God. And so if praise is the goal, on the one hand, the ecological crisis is a disruption of that capacity for creation to praise God, then the other side of the coin is this dynamic of responsibility and irresponsibility for humans, right? Because we're the ones who have the capacity to make conscious choices about how we use the world that God has given us. And other creatures do that by nature. They do that because of their evolutionary development, but they don't do it in the same way, in a way that's loaded with sort of moral significance in the way that it is for us. So while Pope Francis says in the opening, it's all right, we need to be able to use creation in order to live, we need to be thinking very carefully and mindfully about how we're using creation and intentionally using it in ways that avoids destruction or theft, stealing the life of our planet from it. And in a great quote on this, he quote in the very opening, he says, "We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will," speaking about Mother Earth or sister, using this language. Now, here, and I'll mention this again, I don't want to let the gendered language that gets used there slide by unacknowledged, because as again, Elizabeth Johnson, Rosemary Radford Ruther, and other theologians have pointed out, it's really important that here Francis is making an argument against violence, but he's using feminine pronouns, he's using female pronouns. And so there is this sort of obvious but unaddressed parallel between the history of violence against women, sexual violence, and the violence against Mother Earth, that there is this sort of language, even going so far, and I say this carefully, to use that language of the rape of the earth, right, that is sort of under the surface of what is being said here, and that goes unacknowledged in the argument in Laudato Si. So one of the questions I'm consistently raising, reading this from the standpoint of feminist criticism is, what about that? What about that parallel? And I'll say more about that as we get into the argument today. So if our wrongdoing is a form of violence, then what we're concerned about is not just some sort of eternal punishment beyond, life in this world, but it's actually the destruction of our world, the destruction of life in this world. That is really centrally of concern. And for Francis, this is rooted in a forgetfulness of who we are, our vocation as humans, what we are called to be and what we are called to do. He says, we ourselves are dust of the earth, right? Echoing Genesis 2, made from the earth. We are composite creatures of breath and dirt. That's what makes a human in the imagination of the biblical author, right? In Genesis 2, we're a fusion of breath, which is given by God, and dirt, and we've forgotten that connection. And so to get back to that vocation, to reclaim it, to put ourselves back in touch with that is kind of the key first step that Francis is trying to get at as we do this. And as we say, he addresses this completely, we've already said, to all people of goodwill. Right. And so that's the framing. If you want to find the main themes of Laudato Si, just look at those first few paragraphs where he kind of lays it all out, sort of the thesis statement for the whole encyclical, which then he's going to develop, in close, careful analysis in each subsequent chapter. So once that groundwork is established, he connects this, as all good popes do, with the tradition. And he says, I may be the first to write a full-blown encyclical on this, but I'm not the first person to have ever said anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
There's extensive witness in the work of previous popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, John the 23rd. He cites all kinds of sources that consistently, in keeping with the tradition of Catholic social teaching, and maybe some folks here participated in that with my colleague Marcus Mescher, prior to this. But the themes that then come out are these deep concerns for things like exploitation, industrialization, technology, economic growth, consumption patterns, and I think above all for Pope Francis, a lack of social and moral awareness and a lack of the social and moral maturity that it takes in order to act well, in order to act in ways that do not do violence. We think there maybe of the Penitential Act, what we have done and what we have failed to do, kind of both being wrapped up in that tradition, of language. Now, as I just said, there are things that aren't mentioned as well. And I think it's important to acknowledge the things that aren't there. There is not mention of gender and the imbalance of oppression. I'll say more about that later. There's no mention of race, which has been there's been an interesting developing conversation around that, because we do know that, Black and Indigenous people of color groups experience the impacts of climate change at a much higher rate than privileged white folks do throughout the world. There's no mention of colonization, in the history of that legacy, domination in the Catholic Church. And there's no acknowledgement, and maybe this isn't the case, but keep in mind, there's no acknowledgement that maybe Christianity actually in some way has some responsibility to bear for the arising of this crisis, which has been, a topic of scholarly discussion for over 50 years now, since, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, a famous article, Lynn White's The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, was published in 1968. So there's a long history around this, but there's no acknowledgement in France. He says a lot of good in Christianity, but he never says, maybe we were part of the problem, at least not explicitly. And so those are things to think about. Those are gaps that I think we're invited to ponder as we kind of walk through this. And so in the midst of this, and this is getting back at some of the stuff that Tom said about stewardship, right? Pope Francis holds on and pushes forward this idea that the world has been entrusted to us humans. It is given to us, are the words he uses. And in this way, he upholds a stewardship model of the human vocation, wherein we are called as humans to act as God acts, to see creation as God sees it. In an ideal world, that would be great, right? But sin, but social and economic pressures. And so it doesn't always happen in that way. Our world ends up fragmented and fractured in all of these different ways as a result. And so, to use again John 10:10, so often we humans have come to kill and to steal and to destroy, and have not promoted the flourishing of life and the flourishing of creation that God sees as central to the goodness of what creation is. And so as he does this, he constantly and consistently, and this is maybe one of the most important things about Laudato Si, connects ecological concerns with other concerns. And these range from life and sexuality to family and social relations to poverty. And this is going to be the basis on which in chapter 4, he's going to present to us this idea of an integral ecology that unites and brings together every aspect of earthly life under the umbrella of care for creation, not understood just as green stuff, you know, care for creation as the air and the water and animals and plants, right? But care for creation insofar as we and our social and ecological systems are part of this category of creation. Creation is all encompassing in the eyes of Laudato Si. And so we have to attend to that intersection of poverty and social oppression and ecological degradation as sides of a coin or parts of a whole, and not just look at one without looking at the other. And that's a key, really point of emphasis that Francis is going to drive home throughout. All right, so we've already said he makes these connections. He cites Patriarch Bartholomew, who actually in the Eastern Orthodox tradition was talking about this stuff long before Catholics were. And out of this says, you know, that there is a really strong call to conversion. And I think this idea of a conversion, right, toward a conversion that looks out toward the whole of creation is really what the end goal of Laudato Si is. And the thing I would emphasize there is that conversion is practical. Conversion is something that we live out. We're in the season of Lent right now, right? And through practices of prayer and fasting, we try to attune ourselves more and more fully to God's intentions for us and for our world, and then to act in ways that correspond with those intentions. And so keeping in mind that idea of conversion is really central, because what Pope Francis is concerned about, we're going to see this really clearly in Laudato Si chapter 1 and 3 as we get into this problem area a little bit more deeply. He's not just concerned about the practicalities of the crisis. He's not looking for stopgap technological solutions. He thinks we have to change how we're living out our vocation as humans. It goes that deep. It goes all the way to the deepest level, not just of like what we do when we choose, you know, whether to drink water here or to buy bottled water, but that beneath all of that is a question of motivation, is a question of commitment, is a question of faith. And that question is being put to us every time that we are asked to make a moral choice, and that we really need that. And this is why ultimately he says, you know, the solution to all of this is what he calls a bold cultural revolution. Right? What a phrase, a bold cultural revolution that really changes not just what we do on the surface, but who we are and how we understand ourselves in relationship to what's around us. So all of this, I think, for Francis in this introduction comes together in the person of St. Francis of Assisi, you know, which sometimes it's easy to overlook this, right? But keeping in mind that this is one, the name that Pope Francis chose, as he said, and also that if we were to put a number, right, after Pope Francis the blank, the number would be first, 1, right? There's never been a Pope Francis before. In the 800 years since St. Francis of Assisi lived, right, we have never had a Pope take the name of Francis. And so I think there's something really significant for this, you know, once Jesuit Pope, as the Jesuits love, you know, the Jesuits love to claim Pope Francis, and I live in that world, right?
Yeah.
That he took the name of, you know, the founder of the Franciscans. You know, he took Francis of Assisi as his name. This person who is the patron saint of ecology, who in practices of asceticism and fasting and sacrifice and love, you know, entered into this communion, not just with other humans and with God, but into a communion that encompasses the whole of creation. And you know, this man who invited the birds to praise God, who, you know, gave communion to the wolf so it would stop eating the chickens in the town, you know, whatever it is, according to these different legends around, you know, this is the person that Pope Francis chose to take his name from, and he's the first to ever do that. So I think there's something really significant there. And so all of this invites us to, you know, challenge and to rethink the logic of consumerism and exploitation, and to open up new opportunities for conversation and conversion, recognizing, as he does at the end of that introduction, that all too often political will is lacking. economic change is hard. You know, we don't want to change those systems that you know, ensconce wealth and power. And it's really hard to make a case for that. But that's what he's inviting us, asking us to do. And I think in a lot of ways, that introduction really sort of lays all of that out in that kind of way. So that is a really in-depth look, or my particular unique in-depth look at the introduction. Does that all make sense? Any quick thoughts or questions on that? Great. Okay. Well, then let's go into chapter 1 a little bit next. And then we'll move that as the basis for our dialogue kind of coming out of this. All right. So the overarching theme of chapter 1, right, is that Pope Francis talks, as we said in our introductory observations, a lot about the symptoms, what we could call the symptoms of the ecological crisis, you know, the degradation of air and water and poverty and all of these kinds of things. But what I think is important from the get-go, sort of the thesis here, is that the overarching framing here is not just about the symptoms as discrete problems to be addressed, not individual problems. The main concern that Pope Francis wants to raise is that, again, underlying set of assumptions and motivations that drives our way of living in the world and has given rise to these problems. So, for example, he doesn't say, in the way we might typically think about it, that factories are to blame for air pollution, as if to say that if we could just eliminate factories, we'd end air pollution, right? What he's going to say is that humanity's sinful and immature motivations and our unchecked quest for economic expansion and progress is to blame. So factories are like just a concrete manifestation, a concrete example of our human exploitative and destructive tendencies, which are the real root cause of the issue that needs to be addressed if lasting change is going to come. And so he breaks this down in a lot of different ways into sort of separate issues and looks at it, but it's all united around that question of motivation and all of that kind of stuff. So I want to do a quick exercise just to illustrate this with everybody and to kind of show what's going on whenever he does this. All right, so whenever you think, and I'll throw this question just for a quick sort of group brainstorm here. Whenever you all think about climate change, or whenever you think about the ecological crisis, what are some of the things that come to mind? What are some of the things that come to mind? Make a little list here. Just blurt out anything.
Marginalization.
All right. Bonnie, you're too enlightened. You're not supposed to start there. No, okay, go on. That's great. Marginalization, good. What else comes to mind?
Greenhouse gases.
Okay, greenhouse gas emissions. And you all can see the text on the screen?
Yeah,
We can.
Great.
Polluted waters.
Okay, polluted waters. And I'll add to that, I'll just go pollution, right, in general, and air, water, land, all the different forms. What else?
Rise of sea
Okay,
levels.
ecosystems.
Okay, rising sea levels. I heard that one. Let's say the others again.
I said
Impact on
destructive.
those already impoverished.
Okay, increase in poverty. And I heard Judy, disruption.
Impact on those already impoverished.
Good, good. Right. So we think of things like, you know, melting polar ice often comes to mind, right? Things
Right.
like extinction, any other things.
Right.
Destructive
Wildfires.
storms.
Okay, so the longer, stronger storm seasons, good,
Individualism.
good. Individualism. And maybe we'll add to that, you know, consumerism, you know, those sort of isms that surround this. Good. This is a great, I'm just going to do a quick brainstorm list here to get us started, right? So we have all of, you know, these kinds of things that we often think about. The thing that I think is really important here, and this is sort of addressed in Laudato Si, but I'd like to make it a little bit more explicit, is the way that these things are interconnected. Okay, so what are, you know, increase in poverty, marginalization? Well, one of the root causes of that when we think about the ecological crisis is rising sea levels, because coastal peoples, especially coastal indigenous peoples, are driven away from their homes. And they can no longer participate in the economy, so they become poorer because their homelands are being destroyed, right? Greenhouse gas emissions increase, you know, temperatures on the earth, which melts polar ice, which then increases sea levels, which then feeds back into this loop of poverty and all of those kinds of things. Often that can also result in extinction. Stronger storm seasons contribute also to an increase in poverty because they also push people away from their homes. They destroy people's homes, right? And all of this in many ways, I should say consumerism, is motivated by, you know, what we have down here at the bottom. And so the thing that I would point out, you know, is that when global temperatures rise and polar ice caps begin to melt, one of the things that gets lost is some of that white surface of the ice, which reflects, you know, it's called albedo, A-L-B-E-D-O, if you're interested in that, which reflects like a white t-shirt, the sun back up into the sky. So when that happens, sea levels increase in temperature, which causes further melting, which causes further disruption, and so on and so on and so forth, in what we call ultimately a positive feedback loop or a feedback loop, wherein eventually, no matter what we do, the cycle of warming and temperature increase and so on is going to continue even if we stop releasing fossil fuels. You know, and here kind of a secondary thing that also often gets ignored is that within polar ice, right, within polar ice, we have tons of methane, and this is an image of methane bubbles trapped under permafrost. There's a ton of methane trapped in the Earth's ice. And methane is one of the biggest greenhouse gases. And so whenever this stuff happens, right, we are setting into motion not just individual phenomena, but cycles, right? Cycles of phenomena that constantly in various ways are causing the amplification of these issues to continue and the heightening of their impacts as we go forward in the world. Right? And so it's important here to be able to kind of think about these issues. Sorry, one second.
Hello, this is Santa Clara University.
There we go. All right. We need to be able to think about these things, not just as discrete issues, but also as interconnected phenomena, right? That are interconnected with social and with ecological impacts on communities, especially poor communities and all of that, right? So what I think this orients us toward is what I would call a sort of systems thinking, a way of thinking about the world, not just in terms of this, that, and the other thing, but in the terms of the way that everything is interrelated. Pope Francis will say that again and again and again. Everything is connected, right? Everything is connected. And it's for this reason that when I talk about ecology, I typically don't really use the word ecological in isolation as much anymore. I use a word which I borrow from a scholar named William Rees, socio-ecological, recognizing, like Pope Francis, that anytime we think about ecological realities, we're also thinking about social realities and vice versa. You can't pull them apart, right? And Pope Francis, of course, himself recognizes this in that famous quote, right? We must recognize that every ecological approach becomes a social approach so that we can hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the people. Right. And that really is at the heart of what he's up to here. All right.
Well, you have a question in the chat that's asking when you quote Laudato Si, please cite the paragraph number.
Okay, I will do that. I will do that. Thank you, Val, out there. I will do that as we go forward. Thanks, Bonnie, for pointing that out as well. I missed that. All right. So this kind of brings us back to our, root cause analysis that Pope Francis offers. I've just got a few points on this, then we'll kind of open it up for more discussion and questions. The first of those root causes talks about in paragraph 19 and a little bit before it is this thing that he calls rapidification, right at the beginning of chapter 1, right? Which is defined as this sort of increasing pace of life and work wherein ourselves and our technology, and this is the important thing, have come to serve social and economic progress, growth, and expansion, regardless of the costs, ecologically or socially, right? And other side of the coin, do not serve the common good. They do not serve the common good. They serve growth and progress and expansion, but not the common good. If they serve the common good, it would mean that the needs of everyone were being met, that the basic fundamental needs of everyone, to the right to water, the right to clean air, the right to all these things would be happening. But guess what? They're not, right? And so in paragraph 19, he roots this in what he says, quote, a period of irrational confidence in progress and human abilities. And boy, does that not sound true to me. Absolutely 100%, you know, irrational confidence in our own abilities and a sort of loss of the recognition that we are created and that we belong to the system that we were just talking about, right? Every time we exhale, a tree somewhere is going to pick it up and turn it back into oxygen so that other creatures can breathe. That's how interconnected we are. But, you know, spoiler alert, right? The trees don't need us, but we need the trees, right? So there's this dynamic sort of that is not equal, you know, in all of this that is constantly playing out. So rapidification, that rapid economic growth progress. The second underlying cause that he gets at is the thing that he calls throwaway culture, right? And this is really important, this sort of idea that we have, and I admittedly am, you know, guilty of this, that everything is disposable. You know, that, you know, who cares if you use styrofoam or paper plates or whatever it is, we can throw it away, right? Not just goods though, but also people, that people are disposable, that labor is disposable, that the services we provide are disposable, everything, right? And he doesn't mention this, but what I would do, you know, in order to illustrate this point is to recognize when we look at something like food waste, for example, that in the United States, does anybody know about what percentage of food is wasted a year?
40?
50%.
Yeah, close to 40. Most estimates say 33 to 40% of the food that is produced in the United States every year is wasted, meaning goes into landfills, right? Rots and spoils in people's fridges and whatever else it is, right? So why? Well, one of the main reasons for this is industrial agriculture, right? That whenever we use, you know, industrially produced products, that's what I meant to say, sorry. You know, we are participating in a system, whereas, you know, buying direct from farmers, this is not the case, that is not concerned with whether the food gets consumed, okay? Think about this. Major, you know, industrial farms are not concerned with whether food gets consumed. They're concerned with whether it gets sold, right? So they have, you know, sellers who interact with buyers in grocery store chains, and those grocery store chains, you know, buy the stuff. So this is not just about whether your food is organic or not. This is about the whole system of production and sourcing and all of it that ends in that thing. You know, and I often, you know, will say to people like, do you really need 10 pounds of apples if 2 of those pounds are going to, you know, be wasted? Maybe there's a way to go back to an earlier model of consumption. This is what I try to do in my own life, that we buy what we need on a week-to-week basis. Right. And you plan, you know, our recipes are planned, the amount of snacks on fruits or, you know, whatever it is that we want to eat or plan, and we buy for that week. We use it all up. Our fridge is empty on Saturday or Sunday or whatever the end of your thing is, and start over again. This is a way of preventing this, you know, entry into this waste cycle. Along with that, we have things in the tech industry like planned obsolescence. Apple changes the, you know, adapter for a cell phone every few years so that you can't use the old one, right? Well, what does that result in? Tons of e-waste, right? We also have, you know, the recognition that toxic waste, James Cone, a famous Black theologian, has written, and others have shown this, right? That you can predict the locations of communities of color based on the location of landfills and toxic waste dumps. So if you want to talk about how the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor meet, you can look at a map of toxic waste dumps and predict the racial demographic of the population that lives in those areas. That's how entrenched all of these things are together. And so when we talk out of this about the climate as a common good, right? Paragraph 23, he says, the climate belongs to all and is meant for all. Right? So when we think about the climate as a common good, it means that everybody in the world should have a right to clean air and water and all of the things that make life possible, because that's what they're there for. That's what they're there for. They have nourished us since the very beginning of our evolution and are gifts of God to be shared, right? And I think, you know, if I was the Pope Francis really sticking a finger in somebody's ribs, there's a great summary quote on this in paragraph 27, where he says, the exploitation of the planet has already exceeded acceptable limits, and we still have not solved the problem of poverty, right? He says, we got this global consumption thing that's just way out of control, And guess what? We still have rampant poverty in our world,
Right.
you know, and it really drives the point home. He's like, we couldn't even get this right. You know, we got that. And now we've got people going to Mars, you know, and I'm like, what are we going to do? You know, what are we going to do on Mars, the moon, you know, these kinds of things when we can't even kind of get our own house in order, you know, in terms of how we think about the world that we live in. And so he really kind of sticks a finger to, you know, in that way. If I were to think of one focal issue here, the focal issue I would choose is water again, because there is no life without water. You know, we came from the water, we are nourished by water. And now we have an industry, right? Thinking about the way that things get industrialized that produces bottled water when nearly every person everywhere in the United States has access to, you know, clean, drinkable water that costs cents on the dollar, while at the same time, in places like El Salvador, in places like Africa and the global South, there is no access to clean drinking water very easily. It has to be commodified. And in El Salvador in particular, you have places like companies like Coca-Cola that are marketing, you know, Dasani as like, you know, be able to drink your water. But folks are walking around on the streets in New York City right now, right? Purchasing bottles of water that cost $1 or $2 for 20 ounces. And if you do the math, that's more than gasoline, even right now, right? 20 ounces, let's say for $2, right? And you multiply that up to the 160 plus ounces, you're spending $8 to $16 for something that you can get for basically free out of your faucet, while at the same time throughout the world, millions of people living in poverty do not have access to clean drinkable water, right? Talk about an intersection of social and ecological injustice. Every time we consume water from a disposable plastic water bottle, that reality is being evoked. That reality is there hovering in the background, the lack of access and all of the social and environmental costs, as well as the cost to us. We're participating in an economic system that is totally unnecessary, where we could be shipping all of that Dasani, all of that bottled water off to these countries that need it and letting them have it, while we build infrastructure, let's say, to give them clean water, right? These are the possibilities that our sort of economic and corporate commitments don't allow, you know, in this kind of thing. So whenever we talk about action, whenever we talk about practice, what to do, well, I hope you'll never drink bottled water again, one, and, you know, get yourself a nice bottle and, you know, do that. And I also hope that, you know, as we think about these things, we don't just think about the individual responsibility, but we also think about the way that water is being corporatized and industrialized, along with farming, along with deforestation, in ways that is, you know, doing devastating damage, you know, to our world and to the poor, and that we in our own ways are participating in that every time that we make certain choices about what we eat or what we drink and those kinds of things. So I don't have a sort of this is what you need to do kind of thing. I don't like to go in that direction, but I do think there is this is how we need to think that is operating here. This is how we need to reflect, right? About these kinds of things, because that is really what's at the heart and at the root of this. You know, when we talk about global inequality and all of these kinds of things. That makes sense? Kind of how that fits together. That's my bottled water rant, my promised, you know, bottled water rant that I would do. Now, the key principle in all of this, and here we're coming to a close on some of these ideas, is that when Pope Francis talks about these issues, right? He talks about them, you know, in ways that show how interconnected they are, show the way social and ecological injustice are interconnected. The other thing he does is that he highlights this really important principle in sustainability and ecology discourse, which he doesn't cite outright, but is sort of implied there, right? That nature decides what is sustainable. Nature decides what's sustainable. We don't. We label things as sustainable, but nature always has and always will decide what is truly sustainable. And what this means for us is that if we as humans consume at rates that exceed the natural production rate that has been balanced and produced throughout evolutionary history and given to us by God, you know, as a gift, we are destroying our own world and our own lives. And so we need to have what he calls, paragraph 34 and following there, a farsightedness rather than a short-sightedness that is focused on these capitalistic economic gains, and really need to think about the future, not just future generations of humans, but future generations of everything. because it's all connected. If we don't have food, right? If deer don't have food, right? Think about the way that that then destabilizes the whole system of connections, right? That is what ecology is all about. And so we get that evocation, paragraph 49, the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. And in all of this, right, Pope Francis recognizes this poverty thing, even though most of us take in this class, most of the people who have access, importantly, to a class like this live, with privilege, live with enough wealth and enough ability to be able to log on to this thing and listen to me talk for way too long, and all these kinds of things that we're doing, right? We have that and we call it a privilege. That remains to be determined, right? But in the midst of all of this, we have to recognize that the poor, the people that Pope Francis calls the poor, constitute the vast majority of the world's population. Right? It's not us who have access to Zoom classes on Laudato Si, but we can live our lives, in ways that allow us to encounter the reality of poverty and to enter more fully, into these other choices and things like that. So I think that, to me, more than just the analysis of the specific discrete issues, is what chapter 1 is starting to try to get us to think about. What are the underlying motivations? What are the underlying challenges? What are the underlying problems that are really need to be transformed on that deep human level so that we can be put into touch with reality, be affected by them, and then act for change, and that is sort of the framing. Now, to wrap this up, I just want to name 2 things here, which are more in the realm maybe for discussion or critique or question, or just to name them. So that scholars, theologians are talking about this out there in the world, all right? And those are this, all right? The first one is that in the paragraph on population growth near the end of the chapter, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number there, right? Pope Francis does not choose to recognize population growth as a problem, and at the same time puts the phrase reproductive health in quotation marks, so it relativizes it, right? Now, this is a hot button issue in Catholic theological discourse and global discourse. But one way that this intersects with the sort of absence of concerns about women, throughout the, explicit mention of that throughout the encyclical, is that we know that women do the vast majority of the world's work, we could call it, including things like child raising and educating, paragraph 50, thank you, and all of these kinds of things, right, but are not compensated for that work. Most women are not compensated. So it's considered, for lack of a better word, worthless work, right? In the sense that it doesn't have economic worth. But who would drive the economic system without mothers raising their children and, gathering water in African countries or whatever it is, all of these things that are around. So that goes unaddressed throughout Laudato Si, and population growth is not treated as a problem. Rather, he says it's not the number of people, it's how much the people are consuming. So maybe, that's a subject of debate and discussion that we might want to consider. And then the second thing that he brings up as a weakness, is the weakness of international and political will. And I think it's just really important to raise that, because all of this discussion of individual responsibility often acts as sort of like an anesthetic so that we don't think about the need for political and social and economic change on a deep level. So all the stuff about rapidification and progress and short-sightedness is really at the root, but those aren't so much individual issues as they are systemic issues. And so there's this challenge. How do we participate in systemic structural change in a way that's going to lead to meaningful transformation? So that is the end of what I've prepared to talk about. And recognize that we did introductions today and things like that. We have a good amount of time. Sometime we'll have more time in future weeks for discussion and things like that. So I see in the chat, in the Q&A, if you have a question, please, bring in anything. To the anonymous attendee that asked about sharing this presentation, I think Sister Maria said this will be posted within 48 hours to the Spirit Alive YouTube. And so you can check it out there and feel free to share it and watch it as you will. Good. So I want to open it up to our room. And to the people in the room, and also to the people in Q&A land. Feel free to use your Q&A function to chat in a bit. and we'll be happy to answer those questions. But I want to open it up to the room. What questions, comments, thoughts do you have as we come to the end of this first piece of Laudato? Yeah, Judy, start us off.
One thing that you had just said about systemic change, I think I think the not the answer to systemic change, but the answer to the question around it comes from Article 19, where Pope Francis talks about turning what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering. And until that happens, until we can really take on the suffering of the world as our own, systemic change is an uphill battle anyway, but it's not going to happen. I shouldn't say that. I'm always hopeful, but you know, it can't be left up to the people who run the factories and the government leaders and so on to address this, because obviously they're not doing it. But if all of us make this our own personal suffering, what's happening, as people are doing now with Ukraine. But what if we did that with the destruction of the planet and address the issues of the planet with the same emphasis, intensity, and empathy? Things could start to change.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Judy, and the intersection of the individual and the structural there is so important. You know, and I always want to say, you know, echoing the great theologian, you know, Karl Rahner of the 20th century, you know, one can be hopeful without being optimistic. And, you know, optimism maybe is misguided. Hope is not, right? But hope requires that we are able, as you just did so beautifully, to articulate what's really going on with a authentic realism that sometimes looks a lot like a pessimism. It says, like, you know, here's what's really going on and it's not great, but there is the possibility of change, and we have to hold on to that because this can all feel very heavy and difficult. And I think you're right that organizing work, as well as the work that we can make on an individual level, is so vital, and also at the same time challenge those political leaders and corporate leaders and other people who aren't going to be moved because they're benefiting, right? They're benefiting from the way things are, to engage in that change. So activism becomes part of this, work for justice as well. It's all, again, everything is interconnected, you know, in this. Yeah, let's go to Karen.
Yeah, Paul, I appreciated right in the beginning where you pointed out the lack of acknowledgement of sexism and racism and indigenous peoples, and never acknowledging the doctrine of discovery and the role of Christianity. So with all of that being acknowledged that it's not part of it, but yet we're still saying, but we want to enter into this dialogue with all people. So the obvious tension between offering this to all people without that acknowledgement of the role of Christianity within the issues that we're dealing with here. Yeah. So I just, you know, more of a comment than a question of appreciating you putting that out right out there from the beginning, because I think we need to start off with that point as we try to invite all people into this dialogue.
I agree with you 100%, Karen. And you know, while you know, I obviously deeply appreciate what this encyclical is for and what it's about, I will say when I teach this in an undergraduate context, recognizing that, you know, undergraduate students are often they're on the cutting edge of what's going on in society and movements and organizing and that kind of thing. I hear that as a critique consistently from non-Christian students, you know, who say, well, he wants to present this argument as an argument that is oriented toward everyone and toward the whole world. But how is anybody going to buy in when he's not even acknowledging the harm that the Christian tradition has done historically, which is totally wrapped up in these issues of gender and in these issues of colonization and, you know, and expansionism and all of that kind of stuff? Because, you know, like it or not, the same logic that, you know, drove the colonization and conversion of the world is the logic that drove the, you know, economic paradigm that it has exploited and destroyed the world and its resources. And I think we have to take a long, hard look at that reality, and maybe we then have to be the ones to fill that in and be able to engage that as we go forward.
I like the word buy-in, and in addition to, you know, reading and hearing about, Laudato Si, I have found that if you could see the issues, that even helps more. Take, for instance, Chasing Coral. That's a Netflix movie talking about coral reefs and about the status of them throughout the world in the Caribbean. You can talk about it, you can hear about it, but if you photographically see the Great Barrier Reef dying from one photo to another photo to another photo until something so alive and beautiful is dead.
Yeah.
Or plastic ocean. So to encourage, our people that are working with Pope Francis and to work along with what's in Laudato Si, if we can, to get a buy-in, to get that connectiveness, get them to see things in addition to hearing and in addition to reading.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, Tom. And one of the things that, for all of its whatever, good and bad, things like social media and Netflix and, all these kinds of things provide for, they are media by which we can encounter. Think about how important that category of encounter is to Pope Francis, right? Marcus Mesher's book on Francis, The Ethics of Encounter, right? It's all about that. And he says that repeatedly in Laudato Si, that if you want to change people's hearts and minds and get them, as Judy was saying, to really encounter these realities, they have to be able to see it and make it their own, paragraph 19, right? And that is hard work and it's difficult work. But I see it in my classrooms, at least, that once you can have these authentic, powerful conversations about this stuff, change does begin to happen. And it is really powerful. So how do we encounter these realities? I think that's another really practical question. If we're in education, if we're, doing, without being hopeless, without being or overly optimistic, how do we encounter these realities and let people's consciousness be changed? My scholarship is, deeply, deeply rooted in this category of perception, which, Tom, you were just talking about. One of the things I'm most concerned about is how the Christian tradition forms people, not just to live or to act with a sort of moral awareness, but to actually, before they can do that, to see the world in a certain way. So in what ways are our homilies and our general intercessions, or to use a couple of liturgical examples, or our Sunday school programs, or our classrooms, or the things we're doing at our monasteries and communities, in what ways are those teaching people a certain way of seeing the world that then becomes the foundation for how they act, or whether they're able to act in ways that are just and peace building and that do things? Because if you can't see it, how are you going to act for it? Right? We have to come to see the world as God's creation and to have that really deep analysis and all of that kind of stuff first. So maybe a good practical thought on this stuff is that. Joan Gallagher, one of our participants out there, just entered in, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, as Thomas Berry, famous, ecological thinker, spiritual writer, has said, a communion of subjects. So what if we could see that world? What if we could see the world as a communion of subjects, and not just human subjects, but all creatures as subjects in their own right, beloved of God? I think it's a beautiful kind of way of framing it. So I think we have time for maybe one last topic or question here. And I'm going to go out to the Zoom world here, and from Monica Hatcher, asking the question of how I or we as a group would assess the reception of the encyclical or its staying power in the last 7 years. I'll give my quick answer to that, which is that I think we're just starting to see, especially with the recent sort of development of like the toolbox and website and things like that, we're just starting to see this stuff take off. Early on, there was a lot of criticism of this from political and economic figures saying, this Pope shouldn't be talking about ecology, but really what they were saying is this Pope shouldn't be talking about economics and an industry and technology and those kinds of things, because they knew that if we got too far into that, you're going to start to see this change in perception and these practices that are going to disrupt the sort of system that we have. And so maybe, I don't know if out there in the room here, there's one or two other examples that anybody wants to share very briefly about ways that Laudato Si is being activated. But my sense is it's taken a little while, but we're starting to get some good stuff off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And well, then maybe I'll just say as a witness to that, we have things like, you know, Sister Karen's work with land, you know, we have work in dioceses and programs and all of these kinds of things where religious communities and organizations and schools are really trying to do this. And as a preview to what's coming up, after we walk through in the next few weeks, sessions 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, looking at those chapters, in the 7th week, we're going to spend the whole time brainstorming and talking about practical applications, programs for parishes and schools and other things like that, so that we can all, everybody that's here, walk away from this series with some things that you can take back to your bishop, or take back to your, you know, superior, or take back just to your, you know, fellow parishioners and teachers, to be able to really help the rubber hit the road, you know, as we go for, help the tofu hit the plate or something like that. I don't know, just for this class, you know, we don't want to talk about rubber, but you know, so that we can really move this forward as we go. So I think, Maria, is it right? We've come to the end of our time.
Yeah.
And great. So I thank you all so much for this great first session. I look forward to seeing and hearing from people next week. And if you're looking ahead and you want to read along and participate in that way, read chapter 2 of Laudato Si before our next session. It's going to help really give us a lot of grist for the mill as we get into the continuation of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Paul, and enjoy Hawaii.
Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Paul.
much.
This is great.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
one, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Paul.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Nice
See you
Bye,
soon.
meeting you.
See you
everyone.
next week.
Bye-bye.
Good
Thank
night.
you.